much of what I'm going to say will actually function as a very nice footnote to what John said, so thank you for that. This plays with our title today, looking toward a Catholic communication pedagogy. And on the one hand, I'm going to propose a pedagogy based on one particular course that I teach, which I think is informed by what it is to be Catholic. On the other hand, this pedagogy could also be a pedagogy of Catholicism, because I've used the particular class to focus on theology. All right, how do we advance the slide? Let's try that one. Now, I'm going to use the Anselmian definition of theology as faith-seeking understanding. And that allows us to kind of say, well, first, what theology is not in this context? We're not talking about catechism. We're not talking about doctrine. I mean, these, of course, are important to Catholicism, but that's not what this kind of theology is. We're not even talking about history. It's not the theological history, nor spirituality. But really what we want is to encourage a systematic reflection on belief, that sense of faith-seeking understanding. We want the students to try to deepen their understanding of faith. And I'm going to be using the media ecology approach, which is familiar, I know, to some of the people here, and I'll apologize in advance for making this very simplistic for those of you who know this so well. But the metaphor is of an ecosystem or an environment, and we could take the traditional, pond in the forest, and you have all of the different things, the fish in the pond, the frogs living on the side, the bugs and the grasses and the birds and the trees and all of those things end up into kind of a balanced system that reaches an equilibrium. Well, if we substitute communication, not just the technologies, but that's certainly part of the ecosystem, but also the people who are creating content, consuming content, the ideas that we have, all of these things, again, form a kind of balanced ecosystem. And just to give a sense of how that works, if we put a new frog in the pond, somebody comes along and releases a different species, all of a sudden everything in that pond changes. Well, we've done as much with our communication. Just now, not even 20 years ago, we introduced this called smartphone. And that phone has changed the entire communication ecosystem. And it changes how people get their news. It changes, students don't use their phone as a phone. They almost never make a phone call. But they're texting constantly. They're checking their updates on their Instagram feed. They're looking at all kinds of other things. This changes how people view screen content, because we no longer talk about watching television. No, we're going to watch YouTube clips. The entire communication ecosystem has changed because of changing this one part of it. So that's what we're going to try to move into. And I would say there is also a theological ecosystem, and that dwells within and interacts with other ecosystems, including the culture. And so not surprisingly, as we know so well, different cultures produce different kind of theological concerns. There is a historical ecosystem, which theology again functions within. Anyone who does theological history knows how this changed over the centuries. But also theology dwells in a communication ecosystem. And depending on what we do with that will change our theology. And so we can talk about the different media channels. And those, we recognize, in fact, as John was talking about using literature or poetry, these are communication channels, and they allow certain kinds of questions to be asked within that theological world. One thing that got me started on this with the class was a communication class, but trying to reach out to students to encourage them in their theological thinking, and to kind of test the sort of media ecology thing, which tells us that if we change the communication channels, the ecosystem could change. So what happens in theology, because we have a nice 2,000 plus year history of theology, as we look at different communication channels? Does theology change in terms of those channels? And I think we could argue that yes, it does. And so we're trying to get a sort of systemic approach to theology. As both a communication pedagogy. How do we want students to understand communication? I'm going to try to get them to do some of this, but to do it, they have to learn something about theology. So we're shifting from reading theology to doing theology. And the students have been used to reading theology, and that's why many of them think theology is the catechism, because that's what we grew up reading. Or they think theology is whatever it is, instead of looking at how they seek to understand their faith. Interestingly to me, I taught this course a number of times, and even the students who do not identify as Catholic, some of them, fill in the box none when you ask their religious affiliation. I've had students who are Muslim, I've had students who are Buddhist, I've had students, from a whole range of traditions. All of them immediately get what it is to reflect on their belief. And if I ask them to do a project in which they have to reflect on their belief, in fact, I will tell them, you have to do a project for the class, it can be anything except a written essay. And they immediately have a theological question to ask. And so, we can't say that theology is dead among this generation. Our media may be dead among this generation. So to help them get the start, and I'm going to do a quick little tour of this to try to give you a sense of the pedagogy rather than to, give the entire development of these kinds of ideas. But to help them understand the idea of an ecosystem, I'll start with the physical environment. And so if we look at how theology gets built into Christian spaces, we can look at some churches. And then literally I will take a field trip and we will go to different churches and ask them to reflect on, what do you feel when you come into this space? What have you noticed in this space? Some things, we have an architectural pattern. Christian churches generally follow this kind of cruciform design. And there is a theological something that's there. The cross is sacred to us, and people who build churches want to lock us into that. The way churches deal with elevation, almost every church, you have to come up a series of steps to come into the church, and often within the church you come up with a series of steps. There is what one of my professors used to call, a kind of theological geography. Heaven's up, earth is in the middle, hell's below. But the churches build that in because we walk up the steps to come to a sacred space. They're oriented toward the east. And again, this sense of the risen Christ, the rising sun, which is going to be here. And even as we change locations for churches, we bring much of this with us. The way we decorate the churches is often driven by theology. And to help the students get that, we'll walk into a church like this. This happens to be the Brompton Oratory in London, which is modeled on St. Peter's Basilica. And you have this Baroque style. Everything is covered with text, with statues. If you get there when the organ is playing, it becomes, you're inside this magnificent instrument that kind of echoes within the church. It is a feast for the senses. And it is very Catholic because the senses matter. And we experience God in all of our humanity. Walk down the street, and here's St. Columba's Presbyterian Church, a post-Reformation church. And for theological reasons, the Reformation reformers wanted to strip out the decoration of the churches. And students pretty much get this. You walk in and, what's different? And yeah, you can see what's different. Or we could do another contrast. This is the Russian Orthodox cathedral. And again, it's a different worship space which confronts us, in the fact that instead of a rude screen, you have the iconostasis, and you don't even see the sacred space of the altar. You hear the ceremony instead. And so just to give them a sense of what do we mean when we're talking about an ecosystem, an ecology, let's look at this physically built in. These spaces tell us something about what we believe. And if you grow up in one of those spaces, that carries through our entire lives. Richard Blake, Jesuit film critic, has a book on the something imagination, which I just blanked on the title. This happens when you teach too long, But he argues that, if you look at film directors, and he says he can tell what their religious tradition is by watching their films. Because the way they use imagery, the way they deal with relationship, the way they deal with framing things, reflects churches in which they would have grown up. I mean, this deeply affects us in ways we don't even understand. What we're getting at in a lot of this is a way of thinking. And I appreciate, John, what you were doing, and you're talking to us about a way of thinking that comes through literature that particular, in the types of truths that are there. It doesn't mean that that's the only way of thinking. And when we start looking at the media channels, now this one happened to be physical environment, we get a way of thinking. Oral communication has another way of thinking. We try to kind of reclaim this with these studies of orality and literacy in oral cultures. We know the Gospels were performance texts. They were not started as a written text or an essay, but this was the proclamation of the good news of Jesus. And people would tell that story or perform that story because, again, in the Greek world and the Roman world of the time, if you weren't a good storyteller, nobody was going to hang around. And so you have the storm at sea, and you can just see those waves crashing and the disciples fearful and all of this. What do? We're not in oral culture, so we read it. And it's like, well, okay, we got the words, and then everybody's falling asleep. You hinted a little bit in this about there's a narrative theology which comes from it. It's a structure of storytelling. When we tell stories, this is what captures people's imagination with the films, with the other kinds of things we've mentioned, because it is the very fact that we are telling a story is what communicates the truth we're after. You can contrast the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of John, two very different ways of telling the story of Jesus, and each with a particular theological kind of basis for it. And so the theology is there, but not in the form we might be looking for. One thing I have the students do is when I say collect a story of faith. If they're brave, they'll go up to a stranger. If they're not, they go to someone they know, because I tell me a story of faith. So, Brett, I could go to you and say, Brett, tell me a story of faith. And it's fascinating what people tell me. It can be a personal religious experience. It can be an experience where someone says, I talked to my uncle and he told me about the time he almost died when he was a teenager. And, or someone else, my grandfather died and my mother at that moment had this kind of sense of presence. Or others, story of faith is, a flat tire as we were coming into school and we managed it. But everybody can, and I asked them, okay, let's analyze it. Why is this a story of faith? Now, we can also, and you already did the poetry, so I won't go into more of the poetry, but here are some. Obviously we have Christian poetry, varies by culture and time period. It's another way of communicating. Poetry is an oral way of thinking. And it is a way of thinking that enables us, as you mentioned, some of the classical poets, to enter into that world, the dream of the rude, and it does something to us, and we're confronted with it. Or if we look at poetry closer to our own time, something like the John Donne is "Batter My Heart, Three-Person God," and you read that sonnet, and it again carries you into his religious experience. And then we begin to say, well, my religious experience is like that as well. And you recognize Donne is reflecting on his belief. Why is it that I so resist God? Why is it that I beg God, batter my heart, break me down? I need to belong to you. Or a very different kind of sensibility, the Victorian poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, thou mastering me, God, giver of breath and bread, Lord, sway of the sea, Lord of living and dead. You get this. This is what this man so deeply believed, and because it touches our lives. But it's a completely different way of thinking from the architecture of the church. It's a different way of experiencing theology. Now, normally I wouldn't do this, in a short period of time. We'd have weeks at a time going through that. But okay, let's switch to a different communication medium and think about art. Christians have expressed their belief in art. These are catacomb inscriptions or symbols. And so 2nd century, 3rd century. And again, you have a complete theological sensitivity when people think this way. Why do you have, the anchor as the symbol, and now the fish, kind of almost feeding on it? Or the little more decorated one on the right with the Chi-Rho and the kind of image of the risen one praying. It's a way of thinking about what's most essential. If I am living in a culture that is under persecution, I need to signal to others what I believe. I need to reinforce that faith and encourage that faith in a quick way. You go on a few centuries, and now Christianity is legal, and you begin spending more time on the art. There's more representational art. Some of this is from Ravenna, and you have these symbols or parts of the Christian life. So you have Jesus feeding the disciples, or you have the baptism of the Lord, because that's part of our experience. I'm reflecting on my belief, what it is for me to be baptized, because now I am recapitulating the life of Jesus. What is it for me to be fed with these loaves and fishes? I am again recapitulating something. But I'm thinking not in a discursive way of thinking. I'm thinking in that imagistic way of thinking. This images tells me who I am. This image tells our community what's most valuable to us. It's going to change. We move ahead some centuries, and we start getting Renaissance art, and much more detailed. It's also the ecosystem of art has changed now, and we have different methods of presenting things. But you look at the choice of themes that people are doing, and we get, again, a sense of what this particular ecosystem means. Why is it important that we, recognize, people coming to worship the newborn? Why is it important to have Jesus preaching in the temple as a teenager? That was supposed to be set from that time of Luke's gospel. Or you look at the other Renaissance themes, there's Jesus healing the blind man, or the crucifixion. And anybody who's an art historian, can begin to tell us about how is this way of thinking become a way of seeing. And we see the world in a Christian way. And we begin to understand that this speaks to us of what we believe. And it's not simply the scene, we believe that Jesus died. It's not simply the scene that we believe that Jesus could restore sight to the blind, but it's the way in which these are composed, the way in which they're done. And if we need a contrast, we take a look at something like, Andrei Rublev's famous painting, The Hospitality of Abraham, and you get the three angels, which for him is a symbolic representation of the Trinity. It has a very different impact because it's a different culture thinking. And so even though it's the same communication channel, which is visual, the cultural difference asks us to experience it differently. And there are essays galore written about this particular icon in terms of the symbolism that's there and how you see the love of the Trinity expressed here, and that even to the gestures, of the fingers of the different figures and all of those kinds of things. And I want to resist that a little bit because we end up trying to impose our literacy. I'm going to read the icon rather than to say, what does this do to me? How do I respond? How do I see in a theological way? Okay. This is Tuesday, it must be Belgium. We're going to switch to our next communication medium. Let's think about music. This one's the toughest one for me. I'm not a musician, and so I always wrestle with these kinds of things. But music is another way of reflecting on what we believe. And the very creation of music is theological because we are aligned now with God's creative power. Musicians will talk about, in a sense of sharing in this power of God. And I've had students who are musicians who, for class projects, have composed pieces of music or performed pieces of music because it is for them a way of believing, and it expresses their belief. Music can also be a site of reflection for us, as all of us have had. Sometimes there's a particular piece that is there. There are the whole range of experiences. There is a chance, which really is taking a text and performing it in a different way. Or there are interpretations, and you look at some of Bach's work, for example, and he has the different musical themes for the individuals in the oratorio, and he's expressing a theological relationship by the way in which he has written the musical pieces and the lines for the different ones. Or we could look at popular hymnody. Think of all of the things that we sing in church, and if you listen to them carefully, you might be shocked by the theological content of them. There's the one, we shall build the kingdom of God. I thought God was building the kingdom of God, not us. But, or that other one, that anthem, it's God loves the humble and whatever, and yet we're singing as though we're kind of marching along. Sort of reminds me of my childhood, if you knew the Catholic action, army of youth. A few of a certain age will remember that. But where the music doesn't quite fit with the lyrics. But, we're invited into it. I had an experience last fall to hear a performance of Benjamin Britten's War Requiem, and all of a sudden it sort of dawned on me what a musician can do, a composer can do, to express a theological belief. The War Requiem was written for the rededication of Coventry, or the dedication of the new Coventry Cathedral. The Cathedral of Coventry was destroyed in the Second World War, and it was rededicated in 1962. Britten, the famous British composer, was asked to write a requiem to perform in that place. And we're probably all familiar with the requiem format, which is typically, the Kyrie and then the Dies Irae and the various mass parts. What he did is he reimagined this first in terms of the music. And so he has 3 choirs, a women's choir, a men's choir, and a boys' choir. And they're situated in different places in the church space. He has 2 orchestras, a full orchestra and a chamber orchestra. He has 4 soloists, the different voices, and so when the choirs are singing, the full orchestra plays. When the soloists are singing, the chamber orchestra plays. And then he juxtaposes the traditional parts of the Requiem with musical settings that he's done of Wilfred Owen's poetry from the First World War, that poetry from the trenches. And you get this performance where you're having really a theological reflection of how we understand war and how we understand ourselves before God when we do such evil as participate in war. And then you have, the way he sets it, is the boys' choir is up above in the choir and sings only certain parts which reflect a kind of voice of God speaking back to the community. And so here's a piece of music which expresses a very complex theological statement by where we hear the music, who sings the music, what the music is, and the tradition of how these requiems are normally written and performed. All of this kind of plays a role into that. And so again, it's a different way of thinking. It is not our traditional, what we think of as theology. What we think of as theology is written theology. And all of us who have studied theology, all of us studied anything, know that we study texts. And as Walter Ong famously said, writing affects consciousness. We think differently, and now you have Marianne Wolf, who has shown how the brain structures change when we learn to read and write. And our theological writing tends to be very different. We like it to be clear. So a creed is a great example of a theological writing, or an anathema. This is what it is. There is one truth here, and it is an eternal truth, and that's where we are. It becomes a kind of summary, or we get the commentaries. And this was the big medieval, discovery when you have people writing commentaries on previous theological work. And they were literally glossing text, writing marginalia and things like that. Or you get the kind of encyclopedic structure of the Summa. What this has done is created an expectation that here is how theological thinking should happen. It's going to be evidence-based, with citations. It's going to know the tradition. It's going to be approved by various people. But as a matter of fact, that's not the way most people experience theology. It is one way of thinking, and it is a powerful, important way of thinking, but it is one way of thinking. When you move a few hundred years ahead and get a printed theology, well, first of all, people have to invent a format. I've got to learn to write an essay. I've got to learn to write a book. And those book formats change. I mean, you got the one with the long title kind of working its way down the page. And we've changed now from all this popular expression to specialized works. The arguments are formal arguments with certain kind of logic. We've gotten rid of dialogue. We've gotten rid of a space for other people to say, I've etched my little thing in the catacomb and somebody comes and draws something next to it. But now, and then we have to have it approved. And then there are a lot of reasons why this could happen, but you get something like an imprimatur, and you get various things that we think of in a lot of the history of theology. You also had a change during that Reformed period of pushing art out of the churches, especially in the Reformed tradition. But people didn't stop thinking in images. And so art moves its ways out of the churches into books. And you get these kind of biblical illustrations. Or people start putting up images in their homes. Because now, with printing, it's cheap. You can get a print and you can have this in your house. And we're connected to popular culture in different ways. And so we go beyond kind of Catholic theology, we get the revivals that are so popular within the evangelical traditions. Or religion has to be entertaining. And so you have religious entertainments. And again, it's bringing back the mystery plays, bringing back things that happen, but we've shifted it sometimes into non-religious things. And as John mentioned already, with film. I mean, film is visual storytelling. And it's going to combine all these different kinds of things. Cecil B. DeMille, various versions of the Ten Commandments. What's interesting to me, though, if we look at films, let's set aside all of the things, the Passion of the Christ, things we expect to be religious. A good theologian, I got to reflect on what I believe. And I'm going to work it out, if it's a good filmmaker, in creating a kind of theological world and ask, what if people are in this world? How would they act? How do they understand their belief? And so, if you like Clint Eastwood, he's one of the better theologians around. Gran Torino, wrestling with this question of prejudice and relationships and self-sacrifice, and is it allowable to do evil to accomplish good? Or Million Dollar Baby. Is mercy killing something that is acceptable? But instead of writing an essay as the moral theologians would, he tells a story. And he sucks you into that story, and you think it's going in this direction, and then you end up here, and you better make a decision. And you have all of these other kind of films that are there, but these are different ways of thinking. They're ways of doing theology. And if we look at the media channel, these channels invite us to reflect on our belief, but in different ways. I can't write an essay to do a movie. I can't write a song if I'm going to write a book. Television continues that same thing, and there are all kinds of shows that just, pulls us in to wrestle with things, but they can create a world that goes on for months or years. And if you look at a really popular show, I would wager there is a theological truth that is there. Somebody's wrestling with one of these kinds of questions. I think we kind of already know this, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but we also find it in popular print. Graphic novels And I found this great little thing, graphic novel was invented so people could do theology. But there are ways in which our culture thinks. Now we're thinking in different ways as well with that. So in the popular culture, all these theological forms are here. We have a social function where the church would bring us together to worship. Now we get brought together in this sort of popular culture. The popular culture asks the existential question, what does it mean for us to be human? What does it mean for us to live? The popular culture can, for some people, connect them to a transcendent world. I have an experience of God in a strange kind of way. One quick little story on this. One woman did a long study of teenagers. Many of them grew up in non-religious families and found that they were picking up things from popular culture to create a way of explaining their world. Her book was called From Angels to Aliens. And you picked up little bits and pieces of things that people would say. And these kids were creating a universe to make sense of their lives, but it was informed by their popular culture. We usually end with social media, and here you've got what's called religion online versus online religion. Religion online are the kind of websites you get to the Diocese of San Jose, where I live, you know, the kinds of things where you put out, okay, you got your church bulletin, you got all those kinds of things, versus people who are inviting you, okay, it's the Jesuit ad here, for Ignatian spirituality or any other kind of spirituality. I'm going to be inviting people into blogs, into responses, into thinking together about how I might live out a theological understanding. So the goal of all of this is to help the students experience how people do theology. Invite them into a different theological consciousness, but also help them to reflect on the different communication media, because each of these communication mediums allows us to think in a different way. And we're going to be a different kind of theologian. That doesn't mean that everybody has to be all of those. But if we find out, you know, where theology speaks to me and where I can develop a theological voice, perhaps my voice will be a storytelling voice. Perhaps my voice will be as an academic theologian. Perhaps my voice will be as a cartoonist. Perhaps my voice will be as, you know, who knows? So to try to get to a Catholic communication pedagogy, I want them to learn something about how communication works. And we do that historically by seeing how communications change theology. To get them to understand Catholicism, we try to look at the theology that gets communicated. So there's the quick summary. And Brad, I hope I came up with the right, that fist, you know, you were telling me no time, or you were threatening me, I'm not sure which, but.
There's a 1.
Oh, there's a 1. Oh, that's a trick.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.